Come, nature. Hello, welcome to Gardener's World on a wonderful, blistering summer's day here at Lungo. And I'm keeping the summer flowers going by adding in some tobacco plants here in the cottage garden. Now, there are lots of different types of tobacco plant, but this is a specific one. It's called Nicotiana sylvestris. And it has two really special virtues. The first is it's a whopper. It'll grow about 6 foot tall, it has great big leaves, and really dominates an area. And the second great thing about it is its fragrance. Now, I'm surrounded by roses at the moment, and they have a romantic, soft, pastel scent. Nicotiana sylvestris is completely different. It's rich and musky and voluptuous, and they smell best at night. So it's great to plant it by the edge of a path, which means as you walk around the garden, as dusk falls, the air will be filled with this lovely, rich, heady fragrance. Coming up, we meet a remarkable woman who gave up travelling the world to transform an overgrown swamp into a beautiful garden.
Within every piece of land, there's a beautiful space waiting to be chiselled out.
On the 200th anniversary of Humphrey Repton's death, Adam visits Woburn Abbey to find out how they are restoring his original landscape garden.
If I'm going to get a tour of these gardens, I want to do it in style, 18th century style. Morning, driver.
Morning.
And I shall be planting herbaceous clematis, choosing the right variety for the right. And also, it's time to harvest new potatoes. I have here a water lily. Now, water lilies tend to be magnificent, these great big blooms floating on the water, opening out and surrounded by pads of leaf. But actually, some water lilies are petite. They're really quite small. And of course, it means that if you've only got a little pond, or even just a container with water in it, you can still grow them. And I've got one here, this is Nymphaea candida, and it's got one flower on it, which grows no bigger than that. And the leaves grow perhaps to a spread of 2 feet maximum. Now, I will need to pop this on. First of all, you need to get yourself an aquatic, need to be submerged at all times. Now, in terms of soil, that's exactly what you use, and I've got garden soil here. The important thing is that it's not too fertile. You don't want to take it from a well-manured border or vegetable plot. This should just be a normal clay-based loam. So if you've got sand or chalk, then that won't do. You will have to buy an aquatic compost. The aquatic compost will be loam-based and have fewer nutrients, because too many nutrients will feed the water, and that will encourage algae and other organisms to grow in the pond. However, I'm going to stick with my soil today. And to pot it on is like potting any other plant. You need to give it room for the roots to grow, so I'll put a layer in underneath it. Set it in the middle. And then just pack more soil or compost around the outside. Be careful not to damage the rather brittle shoots. So that could go in the water just like that. There is a slight risk that as you put it in, this loose, friable soil, as it gets wet, will be lifted up, and you see this brown bloom spread across the water. So to avoid that, it's a good idea to cover it with a layer of grit. And as well as holding the soil in place, that will stop fish or any other little aquatic creatures nibbling down into the soil and disturbing it and sending it out into the water. Okay, that is now ready to plant, but I'm not, because I need to put my waders on. So while I'm doing that, I'm going to put it in the shade. The important thing to remember about water lilies is that they are sub-aquatic plants, which means they must be permanently in in the water, underneath. And the big ones can be as deep as 3 foot down. A small one, like this, only needs to be 6 inches to a foot below the surface of the water. It's a little deep. Let's raise that up on a couple of bricks and see where that leaves us. There we go. Reasonably level. Place this on top. Right. The gap between the surface of the water and the top of the soil is like that, which in old money is about 6 inches. It doesn't want to be more than twice that depth, which means that the brick is going to work perfectly. I'll see new growth, and then if I want to, I can come in and take the bricks out, leave it on the bottom, and that's where it can stay. One thing that is important with water lilies is to plant them in still water. If the water is disturbed in any way, either by a fountain or a pump bubbling away, they will not flower. They won't like it at all. What I love about ponds, it doesn't matter how big they are or how small, is they are a magnet for wildlife. Make a pond and the wildlife will come, and that's the best way to have a really healthy garden as well as a fascinating one. But in the middle of our inner cities, wildlife is having a harder time. It's diminishing. However, our second city, Birmingham, is doing something about this. The Canal and River Trust has been working to create wildlife corridors based upon the canal system. Arit has been along to see it in action.
The Birmingham Canal Old Line is a wonderful setting in this city. It dates back to the 18th century, which reminds us of our industrial past. Now, this historic setting is being totally reinvented. Here, the seeds of a new idea are germinating. Called Go Wild in the City, is headed up by Paul Wilkinson at the Canal and River Trust. In the old derelict spaces along the canal, a team of volunteers are making gardens to attract city centre visitors and encourage wildlife. It's so lovely being down by the canal, I have to say, Paul.
We're very lucky to have this water and a corridor that goes straight through the city, connecting the countryside to the city centre. It's a known fact that the city centre is a real barrier for wildlife moving and migration, so we've got real opportunities.
Yeah.
We've also got an awful lot of people. We want them to stop and ask questions about what's going on. It's all about getting people connected to plants, so we need to have that wow factor.
What's going on in this area?
So this one's a semi-shaded area. We've got some scented plants because there's benches and we want people to brush up against them and get that smell and engage them. So we've got some salvias and lavenders. We've also got some quite visual plants going on.
So we're really trying to capture something for everybody. And then, of course, I can't but notice the boat full of flowers.
So this is the second section's in the sunshine, so we've got slightly different plants. And the sort of plants that you'd have seen in a lock cottage. Should we get on the boat and travel up to the next section?
More than happy.
You've been on a boat before?
I love being on canal boats, I have to tell you. It's just one of the most peaceful things. All of those little trees over there, the apple trees and things, are they yours?
Yeah, we've put in fruit trees in these little pockets, and we've also come tree, hopefully.
Fantastic.
And
So
then
you'll
along
have
here
people,
we've got-
you will actually have people eating them?
Oh yeah, we have to have people eating them. Yeah, that's what we're doing it for.
As a conservationist though, Paul, the angle that you really want to get going on down at the canal, just tell me a bit more about that.
We're in the city here, so we're talking about a really degraded ecosystem.
Yeah.
There's lots of brickwork, very little habitat. And so these plants are bringing in that wildlife and now building that ecosystem from the bottom. They're going to have a great impact on the pollinators, the insects. And because there's such a lack of insects here, there's a lack of birds and bats. So once we start to build the number of insects and invertebrates up, the bats will come in.
I guess plant selection's got to be really key, Paul, you know, getting the right pollinators and thinking about drought tolerance.
Some of these are well-known varieties. Some are cultivated varieties of native species, so we know that they'll probably support associated insects that the native plants do. Like the Achillea, that's a nice flat area for certain invertebrates. The Agastache will be good for bumblebees.
I mean, I love echinops, and I'm always see them as total bee magnets in the garden.
You know, the more diversity we have, the more diversity of wildlife we'll attract.
way do you want these, my darling?
I think we should go with maybe taller things at the back and shorter things to the front at the same time.
The volunteers have been kept busy today, and now it's their turn to create a sunny border using plants we've brought along that can manage well without too much maintenance. What sort of reactions do you get from the public as they go by?
Oh, everybody absolutely loves it. We always will be here planting and doing things, and you'll get people coming and stopping and telling us how beautiful it looks and how great it is that, you know, we are wilding up Birmingham city centre, and then we'll be able to tell them about the plants that we've put in and how great they are for pollinators. Yeah. And everyone's just really happy to see it.
And what have you enjoyed most, do you think?
It's been great having such a steep learning curve and learning so much about all these different plants.
You're doing a great job. What about you, Tom? What do you get out of this?
I guess it's seeing the fruits of the labour, really, knowing that it's not only helping the community but wildlife as well. Sort of what it's all about, really, sort of linking the two.
As well as planting to bring in wildlife beside the canal, Paul is really keen to establish aquatic life in the canal. Using coir matting rolls made of coconut fibre allows the roots of the plants to anchor whilst they establish, but will also biodegrade over time.
We had no habitat here, and so we wanted to bring habitat, so we've actually had to build the habitat with the coir roll. But as soon as we did this, we had flies in the city centre, which we haven't had before. We had the banded demoiselles. They're moving northwards, and they need these little stopping step-over stones to get through these urban areas.
They look so pretty.
And of course their larva is aquatic, and that's food for fish, and that brings in the otters. No. And we actually have an otter territory going right through the city centre for the first time this year.
That is amazing. Yeah. I mean, that is awesome. And you know, you could almost go past this, just think, oh, they're nice plants, without really understanding what's going on. I love the way these garden enthusiasts have brought beautiful borders into the heart of the city, and with the flowers have come wildlife and people. One thing I've taken away from this is that nature needs to be right beside us and something that we can reach out and touch.
The thing that strikes me about seeing what can be done in these spaces is that you don't need much space. I love the way there's coir mattings just along the edge of the canal. We're doing such an effective job and yet looking so natural. And I also like the way that a project like that gives a chance for people who don't have access to a garden perhaps to get involved, to get to know about plants, to share the experience of gardening. Now these tree ferns came through winter by the skin of their teeth, I think, because it got really cold here. And they're not designed to survive much below about -5 or 6, and it got down to below -14. However, a Dicksonia, a tree fern, can suffer just as badly from very hot, dry weather as they can from winter cold. And it's one of those plants that it is important to keep moist. And you're not watering the base of the plant, you're watering the roots on the trunk and the leaves. Normally I always say that it's better to water once a week really well. Well, with tree ferns, better to give them a misting every day. Right, that'll do you. I re-sowed my peas the other day, because the first batch were completely eaten off by rabbits, and I put wire around to protect them, and they have mostly germinated and are appearing, and so far are uneaten. The time has come to see how the potatoes that I've been growing in recycled plastic containers are getting on. These are new potatoes, a variety called Casablanca, all sown on the same day, in the same growing medium, and treated in exactly the same way. The big difference is grown in a container made from recycled plastic material, and it looks and feels like felt, and the other is simply an old plastic sack. And you know a potato is ready to harvest when it flowers. And I'll do this one first. As I say, this is a good heavy-duty plant pot. I like it when I see quite small ones. Now, this was a new type of container, and it holds the soil but lets the water run out. So we'll tip it out. Quite a few spuds in there. It's worth pointing out at this stage that although I'm putting the compost back in the container, I will not be reusing it. It is devoid of any nutrition. Put it on the compost heap, spread it on the soil, it'll work in, it'll do no harm at all, but use fresh compost for fresh plants. Let's put that. Right, last, still in flower, is the plastic bag. Oh, it's heavy. Now, it's worth pointing out that round about the end of April, this was showing no signs of life at all. But then 2 little shoots appeared. Since then, it's come on. It's a bit later than the others. You can see it's still in flower. But it is definitely going to have some potatoes in there. Okay, let's see what's in here. I think that is it. Right, let's compare like with like. Well, it seems to me, just looking at them without weighing them or counting them, that the biggest harvest is from the black, large pot. Second, and not far behind, is the recycled container that feels and looks like felt. And notably third is the reused plastic bag. It is worth stressing that the plastic bag had a really bad start in life. The 2 seed potatoes were hit by cold or were too wet and didn't catch up until these were properly established. And to be honest, I'm surprised that there are as many as there are. I really better harvest. But here we are, a couple of spuds put in a container, just watered occasionally, not given any extra treatment other than earthing up about 6 weeks ago, and we've got some spuds. And you didn't need a garden to grow them. That's what I call a result. Now, last summer, we went to Manchester to visit an unusual garden belonging to an extraordinary person. Her name is Sally Berry, and she'd spent a lifetime of exotic travel. But in her 70s, she decided it was time to settle down and tackle a new adventure at home.
When I first saw Valley, it reminded me of Michelangelo's comment that within every stone there's a statue. And I thought, well, within every piece of land there's a beautiful space waiting to be chiseled out. I've always been a bit of a nomad. Everyone expects me to move on after a year or so. Very surprised I've stayed here for so long. When I was 70, I went to Laos on a motorcycle, and it was wonderful travelling up through the mountains. But I thought, well, I think I'm a little bit old for travelling around now. When I got back, my son was a bit concerned, and he said, well, I don't want you travelling around, I have to come and dig you out of some swamp or something. So he bought me this piece of land, which was a swamp. And so at least I'll know where to come and dig you out now, so that's fine. I think probably I've been trying to recreate what I've experienced. So the first part you come into is the orchard. And then you come through a dead hedge, which is a windbreak really, and somewhere for insects to hide out, into what we call the arena, where people can gather. And then from there you go into the wild part, which is the real marshy bit, which has been completely reclaimed. It was just mud. And that's my favourite place, where you see all the birds and the plants are sort of gradually taking over. All my life I've stumbled into challenges and enjoyed them. there was the valley, and it was just sort of calling me, really, I suppose. The biggest challenge was just frustration that I could see a beautiful space just waiting there, but I couldn't really get people to see past the weeds and the mud. The Japanese knotweed and the balsam and convolvulus. I just scythed my way down the valley. We've got 20-foot glacial clay here, and it just sits on the top. So we decided that the idea would be to dig a pond. So a big digger came in and sank. So then we had to get another digger to dig the first digger out. And after that, I decided that probably it was a good idea to do it by hand. Bulrushes were already here. There's willow herb, and the rest of it just appeared. The wildlife is very important to me. I've always wanted a garden with wildlife, so that it's a sort of interchange between people and wildlife. Hopefully, people will appreciate that they need to plant a few wildflowers and weeds. After having watched this crazy old woman in the middle of the field, weeding, gradually people got involved, other people appeared, almost nowhere really. Here's my wonderful volunteers. The valley always attracts the volunteers it needs. Here's John over there.
Hi, Sally.
John does more or less all the heavy jobs that I can't do anymore because my knees are packing up. Una and Brian, they were married here a couple of days ago. They're doing a bit of dead hedging. We took down a willow. Since it's grown here, it feels only fair that it should sort of stay here, even though it's dead. Len and Denise have got a lovely garden, so they come along and just sort of tidy things up for me, which is wonderful. The reason I'm here really because of my daughter, who's got a house just adjoining the valley.
Hey.
That's great! Wonderful. Makes a very nice screen.
Well, it was all a bit overwhelming, and we all kind of really thought that she was a bit mad to actually be contemplating it. But actually, it's slowly evolved and created something quite amazing. It's Sally's determination, I think, which has taken it forward. And what's amazing is this is just a fantastic little bit of countryside in the middle of the city.
My life has been a series of chapters and adventures, and this has been a marvellous adventure, transforming the valley. And it's just wonderful to be able to be here after all my travels. In such a lovely place with the family. What could be better? When I get to 80 in a couple of years' time, I shall throw away, burn all these gardening clothes, they'll all be finished, and I shall walk around with a lovely long dress and a parasol. Don't laugh. Wonderful for me. It's a climax of the journey.
For me, the first is that where there is a will, there is always a way. And remarkable people will do remarkable things, whatever their age or experience. And the second thing is you don't have to have a garden attached to a house. A garden can be anywhere. It can be in a field, it can be a patch of abandoned ground. If you decide you want to make a garden wherever it is, then it's a garden. Now I've decided that I want to add some cucumbers to my garden. This is an Italian variety called Lungo, werde, degli, ortolani, which basically means long green. These are seedlings that I sowed about 3-4 weeks ago. They've grown well. And the key thing about cucumbers is that they like to grow fast. They like heat, food, and water. And I have grown them outside before, but usually I grow them in the greenhouse, and that's what I'm going to do this year. And I've got some great big pots, which I've had for about 20 years now, and they are perfect for growing cucumbers. I've grown pumpkins in them, and it's a very, very effective way of growing them. I've made up a mixture of 1/3 garden compost, 1/3 preparatory compost, and then the rest an even mixture of leaf mould and gritty sand. And I just put 3 plants round the outside, and I've left quite a lot of space at the top, so I can flood them with water if need be. Now, having planted that up, they will need something to climb up. So I just put 3 canes in. That, I will keep this well watered practically daily and feed it with liquid seaweed or liquid comfrey feed at least once a week. Now, it is important to tie it good and tight because I confidently expect this to have to carry the weight of quite a few very large, green and delicious cucumbers. Still to come, Mark Lane uncovers the secrets of cottage garden design, and Nick Bailey celebrates the beauty and variety of the nation's favourite flower. But first, to one of Britain's largest and greatest houses, palace really, it's Woburn Abbey in Bedfordshire, where Adam has paid a visit to see the restoration work that's underway of gardens created by one of our greatest 18th century landscape architects.
Britain is steeped in garden history and has some of the finest landscape gardens. But when asked to name a famous gardener from centuries ago, I think most would say Capability Brown.
Brown Shallow, and his name was Humphrey Repton, and this year marks the bicentenary of his death.
Repton was often regarded as a successor to Capability Brown, but what made him so different was his unique approach. Where Brown created big vistas and expansive landscapes, Repton designed rustic and romantic backdrops, animating landscapes, and breaking down barriers between gardens and parks. For each of his clients, he painted stunning watercolours of what their garden might look like, and these were bound in bespoke red leather books.
This is one of Repton's red books, so there's 200 of these that he actually made, and then 400 gardens. I'm really honest with you, my stomach's going round. I became aware of these when I was trained as a designer, and now I'm getting to sort of flick through one. They are absolutely incredible. But it was a totally different way of delivering a piece of design. He was known for doing these before and afters. He uses these sort of flip-ups, and so you look at the first painting, that's the existing landscape, and then you reveal what was ultimately the dream. And the interesting bit as a designer, I think, he doesn't just paint a landscape, he brings it alive, you know, so the client, I suppose, in a sense, is getting what the dream is.
This very book was put together with the 6th Duke of Bedford in 1802 to create his dream gardens at Woburn Abbey Estate. Sadly, those gardens fell into disrepair, but today the Duchess of Bedford is embarking on a 25-year restoration project, and I've come to see how they're getting on.
If I'm going to get a tour of these gardens, I want to do it in style, 18th century style. Morning, driver.
Morning.
Drive on, old boy. This is a great way to travel and to view the gardens. They would have been designed with this very much in mind.
I'm on my way to meet Estates Garden Manager Martin Townsend. He has played a key role in this restoration project.
So this is a kids' garden, indeed, yeah. I mean, what I love about Repton, in a sense, he really wanted to engage the families, didn't he, in the gardens he's created.
Yeah, and he did that here with this particular project, which is the children's garden. This is the first thing that we actually restored away with. It's all about exciting the senses. So there are spiky plants and soft plants for feel and touch.
So he wouldn't just stop at the safe, he would...
Oh yeah, take it to the danger part as well.
Brilliant.
And the actual venue in the middle there is actually for storytelling, so that's all about the hearing. And then round the back of here we have chamomile lawns, which are for the smell.
You get the sense that Repton was ahead of his time in engaging kids in gardens back then. The aristocracy would have been, the kids would have been...
Yeah, they would have been pushed away from the family, but this particular Duke, he engaged with his family.
Your carriage, sir.
Thank you. So this is the rockery pavilion that we have on top of the rockery there.
We're still where Repton viewed from, in a way.
Yeah, where he intended it to be viewed from. And if we do the overlay there it is as a reveal.
Wow, so that's our oak tree.
Our oak tree there, he's actually put into the actual design. The pavilion on top of the rockery there, with the planting scheme going through it.
So what was this like when, you first sort of took it on to bring it back?
So 14 years ago, it was actually covered in trees. They all had to be removed and we allowed the rockery to resettle. The pavilion wasn't there, so we've actually
taken from this painting here with the pavilion details, and then they were remade, and then we put the pavilion back on top of the rockery. The problem we've got at the minute is the planting is turning out to be quite a bit of a challenge in terms of putting that in place.
The one thing with Repton was actually sometimes the lack of detail in the planting.
Yeah, it was, and that's where we struggled.
Because I look at that and go, well, actually, why don't we, Chinensis, there's lots of plants from China, why don't we add
that would link you back in with the building for sure, yeah.
You can have that idea.
I'll take that one, thank you.
So this is your final project you're at the moment?
So yes, this is basically the menagerie area of Woburn, this being the main aviary in the centre section. We rebuilt that in 2010, using the pictures from here to actually scale it and then put it back into the landscape. And then throughout that whole area there with the cages, and this is where we're going to actually create a hedge line all the way through there. We'll not put the cages back.
What happened with the menagerie then?
So the carnivorous animals actually died out over a period of time, but then the herbivores were then released out into the greater estate. So antelopes and buffalo and things like that were roaming around there right up to about the 1930s.
And planting there?
Yeah, some of this planting in here, actually some of that's behind us here. These are roosting areas for the birds to actually get into.
The whole journey is incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, it really hooks you in. I'm hooked in. I've been here 14 years. I'm hooked into this. But Timar, the Jig and Duchess are. It really is a journey and a love of horticulture.
As a landscape designer, I am fascinated by the journey I've taken today.
I wonder actually whether he'd ever imagined that 200 years on, not only was his work still being built, but it was influencing, the likes of me. Incredible.
I think the most extraordinary thing about Humphrey Repton was the way that he marketed his designs specifically towards the women of the big houses. Repton brought flowers and domesticity, and that transformed everything. And still today, that influence runs through all our gardens, whether they are great estates or a small back garden. Now, I'm trying to introduce a bit more colour into the jewel garden. At this time of year, that's something I'm just piling in, as much colour as I possibly can. And this is a fuchsia called Blacky, which I bought as a little plug for Easter. So I potted it on, and it's quietly grown into a little shrub. And I think if I just put one underneath each of the 4 cannas, this is Canna, Wyoming, for the rest of this summer, that might be quite interesting. And you've got the lovely chocolate cosmos beneath it. You've got the dark chocolatey colour of the leaves. You've got this rich magenta and deep black. That's a good colour combination. Now, Nick shares a lifelong passion for roses and helps demystify what can be for some of us rather daunting subject, however much we love the flowers.
The rose is Britain's favourite flower, and it's been celebrated for generations for its myriad forms, colour and scent. In fact, you voted it as the most influential plant of the last 50 years in a Gardener's World poll last year. But with hundreds of forms, varieties and cultivars out there, you soon realise there's an awful lot to know about the rose. My career in horticulture, which began nearly 30 years ago, started on a rose nursery, and from there on it's given me a lifelong passion for these incredible plants. The rose is certainly a vast and beautiful genus. The choice of your garden can be very confusing. Today, I'm looking at a class of roses which existed long before modern cultivars, the old roses. And these are best defined as the plants which were first identified before 1860. And some of them are truly ancient, dating back to the great palaces of Rome, Persia and Egypt. The flowers became a symbol of love and beauty, and legend has it that Cleopatra scattered her boudoir floor with an inch-deep In the pink, white and purple colour ranges. They're usually quite heavily scented, and the vast majority put on a spectacular display of flower early on in summer. One of the oldest groups of cultivated roses are the gallicas, and this is a fantastic example. This is the apothecary's rose. It is Rosa gallica officinalis, and it's possibly the longest cultivated rose, and there's very good reason for that. It had historic medicinal uses, and a clue is in the name, officinalis. Old Greek pharmacies used to be called officinas, so plants that were used in a medicinal capacity in the past got that name. Now, as a garden plant, it's incredibly useful, not least that it can grow in partial shade, and it also does well in poor soils, which is quite unusual for a rose. Something I particularly love about it is, despite the fact that it's got these near double blooms, they are incredibly open, which means the pollinators can get to them very easily. The other lovely quality it has is this foliage, which has got a sort of dull, muted tone to it, which is a real difference from contemporary roses, which tend to be very glossy. Now, of course, there are other cultivars of gallica that you can try. There's versicolor, which is really dramatic with a pink and white stripe, and there are several other cultivars with red, pink and white tones. So overall, it's an incredibly useful garden plant that'll give you a burst of amazing colour early on in the summer. Roses are highly adaptable plants. In fact, there's a rose for almost every part of your garden. Crucially, all roses like to be kept well watered, and they're hungry plants, so they do like a regular feed. Grown in the Middle East since antiquity, the damask rose really is something special. The thing that makes it unique is that it has the most extraordinary and arguably the strongest scent of all the old roses. So strong, in fact, that it was used to make attar of roses, which of course is one of the scents that you get in Turkish delight. Now, it has particularly useful garden qualities. It makes about a 5-foot plant. It has a sort of dull muted leaf, similar to the Rosa gallica. But there are many different colour forms you can grow in the garden. There are pale pinks like this, near whites, and then darker pinks as well. This is called Catra saison, and it's very unusual amongst the damask roses. Most of the damasks will flower just once at the start of the season. This fella is really special. He'll keep repeating all the way through the season, which to my mind means it's a great plant for modern gardens. Related to their hedgerow cousins are the albas, and what that means is that they have really good pest and disease resistance, and this is a great example of one. It's Queen of Denmark, and I love this plant. It has these lovely matte muted leaves with a slight bluey glaucous tone, so it really makes the flowers pop out from it. What's really special for me is the different stages that the flowers produce. So they start out as this delicate little bud, then they move to something that you can almost wear in a buttonhole, absolute perfection. Then they start to pop open, and then you wind up with these beautiful flat-faced flowers. Now this will grow to 4 or 5 feet, as most of the albas do. Gardeners are often cautious about introducing old roses onto their plots because they have a relatively short flowering window. But I think that fleeting perfection, coupled with incredible scent, means it's worth introducing just 1 or 2 old roses into your garden.
Well, I completely share Nick's passion for roses, although perhaps at one point I slightly diverge, because there is one rule of life that will never change, which is that nobody can have too many roses. And I love the climbers too, and the ramblers. This is wedding day, climbing up the apple tree. A classic rambling rose, and is filled with a mass of clusters of white and touched with yellow blossom. Now, I'm not actually going to plant a rose. This is Gaura. Gaura white sparkle. It's a South African plant, and it's got these lovely, delicate flowers that just hover like butterflies above the stems. Perfect here for the writing garden. And so I'm just going to pop them in the ground. They are actually a perennial, and they will flower for weeks and weeks and weeks. And if the winter isn't too bad, and by that I mean too wet, they will last into next year. But they do like good drainage and lots of sunshine. However, I'm now going to move to the orchard beds to plant something that should last and flower for years. I'm going to plant a couple of clematis into these orchard beds. And whereas these are herbaceous, and herbaceous clematis are really useful in a border. They can either grow laterally and act as a kind of ground cover, or they can sprawl through a shrub. And if you plan them carefully, they make a really good double act, particularly with roses. Now the first is Clematis heracleifolia Cassandra, with multi-stems that grow to about 3-4 foot tall with these intense blue tubular flowers that are fragrant. Whereas most clematis like water-retentive soil where its roots never really dry out, this is one that prefers to have well-drained conditions. So if you have a garden where you struggle to grow clematis because your soil is too light or it's too warm, this is one of the ones you definitely should try. Now, let's go down into here. Most clematis like to be buried deep. However, that is not true for Cassandra. You should plant this so the height is at soil level. Now obviously, even though it likes good drainage, this will need a really good soak, and I'll come back and give it to it when I've planted the second one, which is similar in some ways, but very different in others. Now this is another herbaceous clematis, but it is very different and actually more typical of most that you're likely to come across. It's a Clematis integrifolia. It's one called Twinkle, and what I really like about it are these delicate, almost grey flowers. And whereas Cassandra stands alone, this works best in tandem with another shrub. And what I like to use them for is with a rose that can support it. You plant it near the base of the rose, and then it tangles through the branches, and as the rose finishes flowering, the clematis takes over and the baton gets passed to it. They make a really good team. And because it's herbaceous, you can prune it back right to the ground, and it doesn't interfere or block in any way the performance of the rose. I'm going to plant this right in there and try not to do any damage as I tiptoe through the roses. Luckily, they're not too thorny. Right. This, like most clematis, will like shady roots and sunny flowers. And I'm digging a deeper hole for this because I'm going to bury this one just a little bit deeper in the ground. Right, that's down in the cool, and that will quickly grow up and the flowers will appear as though part of the rose. Now it is important that I give both these clematis a really good soak. No clematis likes to dry out. Other than that, they are no trouble whatsoever. These will grow up, scramble through, flower, and then die back in winter, a little bit of a tidy up in early spring, and that's all you have to do. And this style of planting, where plants sprawl and scramble and mingle freely, is very typical of the cottage garden style. And Mark Lane gives us a masterclass on how to make the most of a cottage garden.
When it comes to garden design, fashions come and go, but there is one style that has timeless appeal. It's the classic cottage garden. The art of a cottage garden is informal design. Masses of ornamental and edible plants are partnered to complement each other, but appear to grow with wild abandon.
The garden is a jumble of floral delight, each plant jostling for space, full of grace and charm, rather than grandeur and formal structure.
Today, I've come to Goodnestone Park in Kent, where Paul Bagshaw is the head gardener.
The instrumental person behind all this was Lady Fitzwater, and it's a very full, romantic style with very pastel colours. There's not one bit of border that's bare, it's all full of plants and flowers, and that was her style.
Now, of course, cottage gardens grew from outside a cottage. Yeah. How on earth do they come to such a stately garden as this?
Well, I think if you look at the origins of cottage gardens, they evolved out of necessity, and people had to supply their own needs to some degree, so they had to grow their own vegetables, and perhaps there was livestock involved as well. And then as they had more money and they had more resources, then they were able to grow more flowers. Partly to begin with, these were herbs and they had their own use, but towards the end they had more aesthetic value as well, so that's how the cottage garden evolved.
So, how do you create the romantic charm of a cottage garden in your own outdoor space? If you love this style, the first thing to bear in mind is what conditions you're working with. Cottage gardens can work anywhere there is plenty of sunlight. Think about the type of soil you have and choose your plants to suit. The other thing to consider is how much maintenance you're going to need to do. Now, I'll have to be honest, cottage gardens require a fair amount of work. Putting out all those seedlings that have gone everywhere, tying in the plants and staking those really tall plants. But if you do have the time, it really is worth the effort. For me, a cottage garden is all about creating an intimate space brimming with flowers. Here they've used tall planting to create a sense of enclosure. But you can do the same with picket fencing or trellis. You can also use pathways to lead your eye to a pretty gate or archway, ideally overflowing with roses or honeysuckle. When cottage gardens first originated, they had to be practical. They provided food and sustenance for the families who owned them. So it's okay to mix your edibles with your ornamentals, and that's what they've done here. And just look at this pineapple mint. It has this beautiful, ruffled texture to it, and it's variegated, and it has the most delicious scent. But there's also Moroccan mint and apple mint. And then there's thyme, which gives you purple flowers. The list is endless, so it can be useful and beautiful. A key element to any cottage border is vertical interest. And what better than these beautiful Eremurus, foxtail lily. Here we have Eremurus robustus with its salmon pink flowers, and then slightly lower, Eremurus Cleopatra with a vibrant orange. That's a really good tip. 2 different varieties, different heights, but they add movement and drama to the border. Perfect plant for ground cover is this beautiful Nymphaea. It has a blue haze to it, and every time you stroke it, it releases this incredible perfume. And what would a cottage garden be without roses? Roses just ooze romance and elegance. Training them over a doorway gives the instant cottage look. And best of all, the scent is of old England. The art of cottage gardening is to make it look relaxed and effortless. Even though a fair amount of effort is actually needed, if you can create something as dreamy and as romantic as this, then surely it's worth it.
Mark is absolutely right when he says that it takes quite a lot of work to make cottage gardens look as though nothing has happened at all. But I like that work. This is how you relate to the garden. This is how you enjoy it. The whole thing becomes very, very personal. And cottage gardening lends itself to that kind of relationship more than any other style. Well, there's always lots to do in a cottage garden. But if you haven't got a cottage garden, don't think you're going to get off, because here are some jobs for you too this weekend. Sow lettuce seeds for harvesting in early autumn. Sprinkle the seeds onto a container, cover them over, and they should be ready to prick out in about 3 weeks' time. At this time of year, some pots completely dry out, and when you try and water them, it just bounces off the surface. So fill a shallow container with water and stand the pots in overnight. They will absorb enough moisture so that thereafter you can water them normally from above. Now is a good time to take semi-ripe cuttings of woody herbs like lavender or rosemary. Choose nice, strong growth, including a little bit of riper stem. Strip off all the lower leaves except for the top inch or so, and then cut them to size. Place the cuttings around a container that has been filled with a very free-draining compost. Water them and put them somewhere sheltered to root. Who wants a raspberry? Do you want one now? Here. Look at that. There's a good girl. Take it gently. You want one too, matey? There you go. As it ripens about the middle of June and go on for perhaps a month, certainly no more than to the end of July here at Longmeadow. But while they last, we eat them daily. They're absolutely delicious. Well, we've run out of time today. And next week, wait for it, we are back on Wednesday at 8 o'clock. Different day, different time. But Nellie, Nigel and myself will be here at Longmeadow. So I'll see you next Wednesday. Till then, bye-bye.